Uh, Good afternoon and welcome. I am Alessandra Lehmen, President of the Environmental Law Commission of the Brazilian Bar, Rio Grande do Sul State Chapter. And it is an immense pleasure to chair this experts panel titled Navigating the Green Transition, where trade meets the bioeconomy, with the invaluable support of our co-hosts from IFF, International Fragrances and Flavors. Before delving into our topic, I want to say that CLGD has established itself as the largest legal event at COPs, featuring every year the most cutting-edge climate law and policy discussions, and always a stellar lineup of panelists. And for this, I wanted to commend the work of the team that is at the helm of this fantastic event, especially Professors Marie-Claire Cordonnier-Seger and Professor Markus Gehring, who is joining us today. So the idea of today's panel is to try to answer three focal questions. How can bioeconomy protect biodiversity, enhance sustainability, and support growth in a circular and inclusive economy? What regulatory frameworks and policies are needed to facilitate trade and bio-based products? And finally, how can legal innovation enhance regime coordination and avoid fragmentation? So by way of introduction, I wanted to highlight the need to foster a sustainable bioeconomy that provides new sources of economic growth and at the same time accelerates the net zero transition and protects natural capital. And I say sustainable bioeconomy because it's important to acknowledge that the bioeconomy does not forcibly equate with sustainable development. There are actually certain elements of the bioeconomy, for example, bioenergy and biomass, which, if not approached sustainably, can actually exacerbate global problems. So considerations of bioeconomy in all of its definitions, biotechnology, bioecology, and bioresources, arise in trade discussions on several fronts. For instance, forests, food systems, fisheries, the blue economy, but a specific focus on nature as an independent topic is still quite new within the trade agenda. So there is, however, a growing recognition that we do need international trade in order to develop a sustainable bioeconomy. So on the one hand, trade can spur global consumption and demand, and therefore contribute to exacerbating biodiversity loss, the climate crisis, and degradation of ecosystems. But on the other hand, trade can play a critical role in promoting biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, and restoration, while supporting an equitable and sustainable bioeconomy that fosters economic growth, creates jobs, and enhances livelihoods. So today we are joined by several distinguished speakers who have graciously agreed to help answer these questions. So we'll hear from each expert for 10 minutes, and we'll take questions at the end of our session. So please do not hesitate to use the Q&A tool. So to set the scene for our discussion today, I would like to welcome Professor Markus Gehring. Professor Gehring is Associate Professor of Law, former Director of the Center for European Legal Studies, Fellow and Director of Studies in Law at Hughes, and a fellow of the Lauterpacht Center for International Law, as well as a distinguished legal scholar. Professor Gehring has been a visiting professor in several law faculties around the world and held a Jean Monnet Research Chair at Personam in Sustainable Development Law at the University of Ottawa Law Faculty in Canada. He serves as lead counsel for sustainable trade, investment and finance law with the Center of International Sustainable Development Law based at McGill University. Professor Gehring, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alessandra, and thank you to the organizers of connecting us in this really important panel. I think we need to start by setting the scene a little bit The transition to a greener economy is no longer optional. It's absolutely imperative. We need to start adopting the legal tools, the legal frameworks that allow us to accelerate the transition to a greener economy. And of course, the bioeconomy is one of the most important elements of that transition. How can we foster rather than frustrate the relationship between biodiversity and trade? It is very clear that for many years that seemed to indicate a one-way relationship where we were using biodiversity for the purposes of trade, but we weren't really giving back some of the benefits from that international connectiveness. And that, I would argue, has shifted in recent years. We are much more aware of the natural environment. We are much more aware that the wrong kind of trade can be harmful to the natural environment, to biodiversity. And so the question that we're trying to answer here is, of course, starting perhaps with the international level. What are the legal rules? What are the legal tools? And one of the preeminent tools that has emerged in recent years is, of course, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Under that global diversity framework, we are now much more in a position than we ever were before to measure, to implement the and break down the international commitments that countries have made in protecting biodiversity, also to the national level, and therefore connecting the global biodiversity framework with the international trade framework. I've said elsewhere, and there's a special issue coming out where we, in particular, review the relationship between the EU and Latin American countries, that the global biodiversity framework, and you see the little pin that I'm wearing representing the wonderful framework, could have the same impact that the Paris Agreement had for the climate change and trade nexus. Rather than seeing them as completely separate spheres, I think adopting a holistic approach and seeing them integrated into trade policy and supply chain is much more fruitful going forward. Because the challenge remains. We want trade, we need trade to reach net zero, but we don't want the kind of trade that only uses and, dare I say, abuses the natural environment, right? So we want to calibrate the trade very carefully so that it is wholly sustainable. And one way, in my view, to do that is to connect with the global biodiversity framework. We shouldn't tell sovereign countries how they protect their own natural resources and their own environment. We should rely on these global international frameworks and ask each country to please share with the world, like they do in the national determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, to also share with the world how they plan to implement the global biodiversity framework. And then based on each country's commitments, identify areas where we can maybe do more trade, where maybe trade has been neglected in certain areas, and where the trade relationship with other countries could be enhanced based on the correct level of integration between the bioeconomy and the global economy. in that sense, we also need to take stock, perhaps, of the latest developments with regards to international trade treaties. So many trade treaties now have sustainable food and sustainable food production articles that enhance cooperation between trading partners. Many, if not all, EU trade agreements have articles on biodiversity and respecting the conventional biological diversity in as a cooperative framework. In the CSDL, we did some research on what happens after you've concluded a trade agreement. Does the relationship end, or can you perhaps move forward collectively? Can your trading partner perhaps help you to fulfill your biodiversity commitments, especially if you have a plan under the global biodiversity framework? Those kind of questions, I think, need to be asked and need to be answered moving forward. And there are some exciting developments. We've seen innovation in the bilateral relationships, particularly with regards to EU trade agreements, which I think are the trade agreements that I unfortunately know best. And the beauty of being part of global climate law and governance day, and previously the biodiversity law and governance day, is that you get to interact with colleagues from other countries. I know there's a lot of concern with regards to supply chain legislation. We've seen quite a bit of hesitation, even by European policymakers, to engage in unilateral so-called autonomous measures. And in our assessment, the way forward should be collaborative rather than unilaterally imposing some kind of arbitrary framework. We need to work with trading partners. We need to build the relationship. And essentially, if it comes to that, also perhaps finance the biodiversity shift, the shift to a greener economy for our trading partners. I think that's a much better way. But perhaps the mix of tools needs to also be respected and enacted. And yeah, with that and these few thoughts, perhaps I can close my intervention, and I'm very happy to answer any questions and to share some of the research that we've done at the University of Cambridge and with the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. Thank you very much, Alessandra.
Thank you very much, Markus, for your always fantastic remarks. I absolutely agree that the way to go needs to be collaborative, and I think there's a majority of Brazilians in this panel, and I think your remarks would be very well received, considering the concerns about autonomous measures, particularly for countries such as Brazil, which is, of course, a large commodities exporter. And I also absolutely agree with a holistic approach. I think regime coordination is the way to go if we want to avoid a siloed approach and to avoid fragmentation among regimes. So thank you again, Markus. And I'm going to turn to Professor Emilio for his considerations. Professor Emilio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alessandra, for the kind invitation. Thank you to the organizers as well of this opportunity to exchange. And I would start saying that actually the first point is very timely, because we all know the potential of bioeconomy to protect biodiversity and to bring sustainable development to underdeveloped regions in the developing world. And this is particularly true in our country, in Brazil, where we have, and also the neighbor countries in the Amazon basin, where we have now millions and millions of people living in cities and living also in rural areas, deprived of basic needs and basic service satisfaction. So actually, the first concern that always we have, thinking of bioeconomy, is, well, what we know best about bioeconomy so far is bioenergy, and then come concerns of competition with food security, supply chains. And it's important to highlight that depends a lot on the context. Of course, this may be a concern, for instance, in some Asian or African countries, depending on the ratio between demographics, natural resources, and technologies available. But in other countries, for instance, as in the Amazon in general, and particularly in Brazil, we have seen that there are all the conditions to simultaneously increase bioenergy and food production and agricultural exports. We have now in Brazil 10 years of a recession, but the previous 10 years, we had an illustration of a very good economic growth rates with very substantial increases, both in ethanol production from sugarcane, sugar, and meat production, meat exports, together with increasing food security, improvement of income distribution for the first time in Brazilian history. So actually the potential is there. Now, on the second point, why and how to have regulations that can help in that regard, and particularly going beyond bioenergy to all the potential of bioeconomy in different supply chains for pharmaceuticals and cosmetics and a number of other applications, is actually because we need to build the demand and the supply chains. And I think one crucial tool in that regard is certification standards. We have some examples, good and bad, from the voluntary carbon market, for instance, because nature-based solutions suddenly 2 years ago, by 2021, had a boom in the voluntary carbon market with an explosion in the number of projects, the quantity of avoided emissions, and the price as well, for the first time, was higher than the price, for instance, from emission reductions from renewables. And that was actually the acknowledgement of a number of the so-called co-benefits that now are very well translated in the Biodiversity Convention, also with the concept of biodiversity credits, and also the social component of helping local communities, also indigenous peoples, to actually benefit from this kind of project earnings. Now, we also had in the last 2 years the contrary picture. That means that there was, due to some scandals of bad projects, due to problems with the integrity of methodologies and verification procedures, this price has fallen down, and now it's at the bottom line. Now, I think the certification standards and the enforcement of good verification based on sound science, on methodological approach, and the closest as possible to regulated markets that actually can set the bar higher in order to have a better standard for the voluntary market is very important. And we can not agree more with the previous propositions by Professor Gehring, that this kind of approach, this kind of establishing of this certification standard should be bilateral or multilateral, actually, instead of just unilaterally, arbitrarily create a framework, because this is bound to create reactions in terms of questioning why some methodologies are said. For instance, it's not very easy from the perspective of developing countries to understand why CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, would not include greenhouse emissions from scope 2, that means from power generation, in the calculation of the carbon footprint of goods exported to the EU, just to name an example, which goes against all what is already established by the science, that the carbon footprint should be the most say accurate as possible using life cycle analysis, and is also already in practice through the greenhouse gas protocol in many parts of the world. So the same applies to bioeconomy. I remember some 20 years ago, I think, when Michael Bloomberg was the mayor at New York City. I was there in the UN headquarters and listened to his speech. I think he was founding C40 network, something like that. And he was proud, among all the achievements he had in managing the New York City towards a more environmental orientation administration, that in the rail system, the subways and trains of New York City, he was proud of announcing that he was replacing the wood parts of the track that were subject to deforestation footprint by plastic ones. So that's exactly the kind of reaction that we should avoid in terms of creating, on the contrary, through a sound certification standard, the way to have a sustainable supply chain in order to meet this kind of demand in the developed world as well. So I think this is a central concern that trade can help. We have some examples of international cooperation. For instance, we have the Amazon Fund in Brazil, and now also to the neighboring Amazon countries. And through these tools, we can help a number of supply chains to be created, not only acai, but cupuaçu and Brazilian nuts, and a number of different products, and also with different application in pharmaceutical and cosmetic works, besides bioenergy, of course. So I think I would stop there in the interest of time, but I think this dialogue between the North and South, globally speaking, is very important to have common certification standards that can actually serve the cause of sustainability and not being, again, a hurdle in the dialogue because it actually hurts multilateralism. And with all the difficulties, particularly in current times, we have with multilateralism, we have no way out of multilateralism to actually to face global challenges as climate change and biodiversity protection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Emilio, and I must apologize because I failed to properly introduce you, so I'm going to do it now. So Professor Emilio Lèbre Rovere is full professor of the Energy Planning Program, head of the Environmental Sciences Laboratory at the Center for Integrated Studies on Climate Change and the Environment, Centro Clima, at the Institute for Research and Graduate Studies of Engineering at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Professor Emilio graduated in engineering and in economics, and he has an MSc in systems engineering by COPE at the Federal University of Rio. He holds a PhD in economics by the School of High Studies in Social Sciences, University of Paris in France. And finally, Professor Emilio is co-author of several IPCC reports, contributing since 1992 to the award of 50% of the Nobel Peace Prize to the IPCC in 2007, and was a member of the High-Level Commission on Carbon Prices that published the Stiglitz-Stern report in 2017. So thank you. I apologize for the oversight, and thank you, Professor Emilio, for, I think for us as legal experts, it's music to our ears to listen to your emphatic defense of science-strong regulation. And I also agree that we need to learn from the mistakes of both the voluntary carbon markets and previously under Kyoto, the CDM experience in Brazil, particularly now that we are very close, and perhaps we can discuss this during our Q&A session, that we are very close to finally, very close to the creation of a regulated carbon market in Brazil. So thank you again, Professor Emilio. And I will now turn to Ms. Mayra Souza, Trade Director at IFF and our co-host for the session. So Ms. Souza holds a specialization in trade policy from the Harvard Kennedy School, and MSc in international business from the University of Birmingham. Additionally, she is a W50 leadership scholar at the London School of Economics and a fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Mayra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alessandra. And it's really my pleasure to co-host the session with this amazing panel of experts. So thank you for having me here today. So I would start by saying that by the different visions that you share on bioeconomy, right? I would add that we see also more and more about circular bioeconomy and also social bioeconomy. What we see, and indeed has been mentioned by both professors, bioeconomy has been recognizing and contributing to a number of SDGs, 11, 12, depends on what type of data that we're looking at, and it holds really a great potential in terms of being one of the key drivers for the 5th industrial revolution. The market potential of bioeconomy currently stands at $4 trillion and is poised to surge to about 30 trillion by 2050. Of course, as IFF is a biotech company, I do have to focus on the biotechnology vision. And then for me, it's a great pleasure then to be talking about. So what we see, and indeed has been mentioned by both professors, bioeconomy now has been really gained a lot of traction, attention, especially in my role. What we see is also technology race happening, competition, also fostered by clean industrial policies. But anyway, when I want to focus on the biotechnology vision, and then that's when we are talking about modifying living organisms, right? All parts of it, and adding materials to non-living or living materials to produce knowledge, goods, and service. That's where we have great potential as well in view of bioeconomy. And as mentioned, those sort of innovations and solutions, they can help fighting food security, for instance, also biodiversity prevention, and so on. But we do face challenges. A lot of education is needed for that. And when I mention about this technological race, we see because with these green industrial policies, we have initiatives by the US, by developed countries and developing ones as well, such as BRICS. So we have US stimulus incentives. We see with IRA, US measures as well on biotech and biomanufacturing. Recently, the EU has been already publishing strategies on bioeconomy. And then March this year also published communication on biotech and manufacturing as well. And then we expect a future EU Biotech Act, potentially in 2025. And then what we see is that really an increase of different countries establishing their national bioeconomy strategies. They have different approaches, different goals, and this also caused a little bit of a challenge, like how do you really measure the benefit of bioeconomy if you have different standards and even goals on what is to be reached. So what I want to say is that, and just to give an example, make it more tangible in biotech, and I'll just give a list, of course, IFF examples. We talk about biopolymers, right? And it's a great opportunity, but we also face regulatory challenge. So if I take the solution developed by IFF, for example, we're talking about producing alternatives to plastics, so biopolymer with using water, enzyme, and sugar, right? But what we experience is that in a country, as a multinational company, this is considered as an alternative to plastic, but depending on the other country or even within the same region, and then if I take you as an example here, some inconsistency on policies. One policy within the EU will consider as an alternative to plastic, but it would take this very same example that I mentioned, like with single-use plastics directive, because this biopolymer, the polymerization happened in the industrial environment and not in nature, then it is considered a plastic. And then you see already how those inconsistencies that happen, because what I treated as a plastic will face the same regulatory burden as well. So I would mention this one. Another second example, because it's really also very important, what is called the new genome techniques, is a very advanced methodology, once again, of modifying microorganisms in different ways. But we face a sort of similar regulatory challenge because it's being treated as genetically modified organisms. And if I take you as an example, the regulatory burden is very high. And I'm just bringing these examples because if you take a biopolymer and the one that is developed by IFF, is biodegradable, is renewable, and has all sort of benefits. The same goes with the new genome techniques as well. And these are just two examples I'm bringing in. Of course, we face more than that, but it's just to illustrate. So I have been working now for about 2 years, focused on bioeconomy and, of course, biotech. And then what I start saying is that First of all, we have the regulatory difference, the national strategies that are coming up, they also differ from one region because, of course, the countries, they have different needs. And then we also have international organizations working with bioeconomy already, some of them for a few years. So we have OECD, for instance, we have the Food Agriculture Organization, you have UNCTAD, focused on biotrade, which is more on biodiversity, and other international platforms such as the World Bioeconomic Forum, actually just happened a few days ago. They have different approaches, different concepts or definitions of what is bioeconomy, right? Because we don't have one. But what I see, and this has been sort of mentioned as well, is an alignment at multilateral level, at least defining some, starting at least with some basics, right? So I would see of a convergence what those different organizations are viewing, I mean, what they foresee in terms of bioeconomy, if we possibly having more at least harmonized standards or even definitions, right? Respecting the different needs and realities of each country, which might differ from one to another. So on challenges, as I mentioned, regulatory hurdles, if you have there your bio-based product, market access, definitely an issue, no doubt. We cannot talk about bioeconomy without thinking of sustainable mass as well, as mentioned by Professor Emilio as well. But there, what I wanted to say, even though today there are studies out there that the supply of biomass is not, cannot yet supply all the demand, right? There are technological developments that can help that, and then also if we have a better management of biomass. So a recent study from FAO, just published just in September, for instance. If I take this example of biopolymer that I mentioned before, according to FAO, only 0.03% of biomass is used in the production of bio-based polymer. And then goes according to the different generations of biomass and once again to the different type of technology. So what I want to say is, like, as we have technological advancements, I think we also need some better awareness and education of those innovations out there to think of the positive that it can really help this shift to the green transition. There are a few challenges. Another one I would say, once again, highly important in the biosecurity. When we talk about biotechnology, of course, we need to safeguard against risks of bioterrorism as well. And then with that, we see concerns in national security. Biotechnology, it is considered a green tech and also considered a critical technology. So it has been also been included in foreign direct investment mechanism, inbound and outbound. And then also AI-related policies to safeguard as well biotech innovation, because once again, of biosecurity. But anyway, what I wanted to focus is definitely on the trade aspects. As mentioned by both professors, the role of trade in advancing bioeconomy, biotechnology, biomanufacturing is key. Trade is a critical enabler and indeed can work for the good or for the bad, depending on how you apply. And that's why we need to have good regulatory frameworks on that. And it is impacted by several international trade disciplines, right? So, and also WTO agreements. So in the past months, I actually have been researching and working on that. And then for those of you who might be in Baku on Monday, we do have a snapshot of a publication. I have been researching on the intersection of trade and bioeconomy, definitely with the focus on biotechnology. But what, of course, I have seen is that the WTO in itself doesn't have bioeconomy or biotech focused policies, but a lot of those agreements, or once again, disciplines, they do influence even in the trajectory of bioeconomy for the future, right? So once again, we also have, and I like very much what Professor Gehring mentioned about the biodiversity framework, because if we take the framework, we also see some conflicts with WTO agreements. I can think about the precautionary principles as one of them, or the biosafety protocol, when the transboundary movement of living organisms, that is really has a different view between WTO and the biosafety protocol, and many others. So I have at least provided 12 foundational recommendations. And as mentioned about content criteria, so bio-based, normally we have a lower carbon content, they are renewable. On the sustainability criteria, right? For me, this is so important, like how we need to have very good definitions, alignment to what is considered sustainable goods. On the also environmental service as well. So there is a very limited scope today on the WTO what is considered environmental service, and I think definitely this needs to be expanded. So I could talk a lot about this, but once again, I'm going to the time constraint. I'll just keep on that. Maybe one last one that I wanted to mention, we have been talking so much about critical raw materials, and then if you look at the secondary raw materials, once again, bioeconomy is highly important due to its circular models that can help provide some resilience to supply chains as well. So to conclude, my recommendations would be, there is clearly a need to harmonize global standards. Otherwise, we have the innovation, we have the technology, but then we face trade barriers, right? So this is definitely some work to be done. I also believe indeed that we need a more of a structured dialogue at multilateral level, even though taking into account and respecting the different countries and regions' needs. Encouragement as well, investment on the bioeconomy. And there, I know there are even some already some researches and studies like whether we could have a sort of a climate peace clause for this sort of technology, clean tech that helps with the fighting for the climate change. And I would say, I would also consider having, for example, the UNFCCC recognizing the role of bioeconomy. So maybe something for Brazil, COP30 next year to be seen. And my ask would be also for the WTO, because as we see, trade is so relevant, to start mainstreaming bioeconomy, or at least having a dialogue on trade policies. This could be taking as well to the next WTO Ministerial Conference. I have seen similar conversations on biodiversity as well to mainstream into WTO. And lastly, I would just say, to me, the approach needs to continue be based on science-based approach. And I repeated just once more, a lot of education and awareness is needed to understand what does it mean, right? As well for the wider public. One last comment is G20 Brazil this year was the first multilateral, let's say, agreement, high-level principles on bioeconomy, and trade has at least one sentence dedicated in there. So we expect now the high-level principles to be adopted this coming week at G20. And then I also understood there is also South Africa's ambitions for G20 next year, who is then leading the G20 to continue with the initiative on bioeconomy. So I'm very optimistic despite of the challenge, and I would just conclude it here. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mayra, for this wealth of information from a perspective of the private sector. And we very much look forward to reading your upcoming paper. Make sure to share it with us. And so without further ado, we're now going to hear from Ms. Reshma Sharma, who is Global Trade Advisory Director at Deloitte Middle East. She is CTA from the Chartered Institute of Taxation in the UK and also holds a master's degree in the area of international economics from the London School of Economics and Political Science, the University of London. So Reshma, the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes, and we are going to need to keep time because we're going to have a hard stop for this session in the next 25 minutes. So Reshma, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you very much, Alessandra. And thank you all for your amazing insights. I will structure the next 10 minutes into sort of 4 specific sections, talking about what I call the EDG triangle, then moving on to just perhaps drawing on from some of the inspirations we've already talked about on the cornerstones of bioeconomy, having a little bit of an insight on what countries are doing in this space already, and finally, what next? So what is it should regulators or countries and authorities be seeking, given some of the developments so far? So what I call is the EDG triangle is the economy, development, and trade triangle, right? So now we are talking about the bioeconomy here, and that needs no introduction. Of course, we've talked about it sufficiently over the last several minutes. Development, again, is no longer just development or economic development. It is all about sustainable development. I mean, as the world where we are, I think the only option for development is sustainable development. We simply cannot afford any form of development which is not sustainable. And finally, trade is no longer just internal trade. For many decades now, we are in the global trade paradigm, right? So anything that we do in a country, in a locality has an impact, and similarly, when there is a global trade issue, it has an impact at various levels, local and regional. So bearing that in mind, moving on to my cornerstones of bioeconomy from a development perspective, what we should be thinking of first is unifying the principles for a global bioeconomy with international policy, with trade negotiations, and also making sure the corporate sector is embedded. And I think this also reiterates some of the points Markus was making earlier, or Dr. Gehring was making earlier. The second piece is about there has to be, when we are incorporating or talking about a concept like bioeconomy, well, it's not a concept, it's a reality, but there should be very specific ways to measure bioeconomic development and how it is impacting sustainable development goals. And this needs to be very carefully articulated at all levels from a policy perspective. And these measurements need to happen. So if we are aspiring towards a certain state of bioeconomy enabling sustainable development, we should very carefully define what are the measures, how do we measure that this is actually happening? So which is fundamental to any objective that we are looking towards. For example, targets like food security, that needs to be agreed. And of course, we've talked about other, like how is technology enabling and what sort of technologies and efficiencies can be created. So various measures needs to be defined at a policy level, not only for countries, but also at a global level. The third cornerstone is, of course, linking bioeconomy with multilateral policies and considering implications of some of the recent developments in this space, how that is actually having an impact on bioeconomy. EUDR coming up. How does that impact bioeconomy? I mean, we need to, and again, I'm sure all of us can have another 2-hour session talking about EUDR and its impact on bioeconomy. So I will probably maintain some silence there, but it is extremely important to see if governments or, customs unions like the European Union are coming up with certain policy initiatives. That needs to be carefully, and it's just not EU, I mean, all countries at the global level, we need to carefully evaluate how this is having an impact on sustainable development and an impact on developing countries in particular, looking at, let's say, the African continent or other parts of the developing world. The fourth one, of course, is educators should be very carefully collaborated. I know we, as some of you are educators in the panel here, but we have a certain view of. Well, I don't consider myself. I'm in the corporate sector, but So what I mean is, we as we have a certain view of the world, but we also have to ensure that the real world, the individuals or the corporations or the authorities that actually have an impact on trade, on regulations, are brought into this. And educators should collaborate to define knowledge and skills, not only at a local and regional level, but also at a global level. And finally, there has to be research and development support programs to encourage big breakthrough through projects. And there should be some funding, economic funding, not only from governments, from global organizations, and also from the corporate sector, for this to be enabled. If I go into my third part, is about what are countries doing. So we already know some of the bioscience leaders of the world, thinking of EU, Japan, US. For many years, actually for more than a couple of decades, they are using means of bio-industrialization as a means of reindustrializing and creating wealth in their economies. And that has happened for many, many years now. But can those experiences, or how can those experiences be translated into the developing world and enable sustainable development in other parts of the world as well? While there are some examples of technology transitioning or being awarded or sort of being given away, that has to happen more systematically. Rather than through, certain economic barriers of passing technology, let's say from the developed world to the developing world. So for example, industrial economies like China and India are already seeing and have seen, at least for more than a decade or even longer, biotechnology as an area of innovation. They continue to invest, while these countries, are economic giants, which are fueling the growth of the world in that sense. They are heavily investing in it. But we need to carefully evaluate how can, say, the leaders already, say the EUs, the Japans, and the USs of the world, work together with China, India, collaborating and proliferation of technologies across other parts of the globe, so that additional resources are not spent on simply developing a technology which already exists. So looking at Brazil, South Africa, Malaysia, they are making significant investments to add to their vast biological resources. These are, and we've spoken significantly about Brazil already during the course of the conversation. So that's, I don't want to repeat there, but this was just a quick summary of where things are, how different countries are approaching this, and we're all seems like we're all in the same space. But again, going back to the basic principles of let's share and grow, and that is the sort of policy driven measures that we need to take at a global level. So coming to my last 2 minutes, I'm trying to stick to time here. So what next? So the way I see it is,
you're doing good on time, Reshma. You still have 3 minutes.
See, I've come to my fourth section. So, okay. So what next? So local, regional, and global efforts need to ensure that bioeconomy measures are carefully linked with economic development goals at the mainstream. And going back to my first point that I made, so sustainable development should no longer be a type of economic development. It should be the only way an economy can develop. So we shouldn't say, oh, these are sustainable development goals. So it should be mainstream. Any development goal anywhere should be a sustainable development. We should, and that should be embedded by regulators in their regulations at local, regional, and global levels. And finally, for anything or any initiative or any aspect of bioeconomy to fly, we need to enable the corporate sector to embrace this, to fully be integrated. And while we have some fantastic examples of organizations in the corporate sector who have wholeheartedly adopted this, we also know that sometimes the role of regulators at a local level, I would say, or a country level is more powerful to enable this kind of adoption by the corporate sector. So that really needs to happen. So we simply cannot have just policymakers and educators and grassroots level, charitable organizations harping about it, talking about it. If real change needs to happen, the corporate world needs to embrace this fully at all levels for real change to happen. So with that, I think I'm just on time.
Thank you very much, Reshma. I absolutely agree that sustainable development is the only development there should be. And also, I thank you for sharing your perspectives also from the corporate sector. And in the interest of time, and without further ado, we'll now hear from our last panelist, Dr. Caroline Medeiros Rocha Frasson is Director of Public Policy and Engagement at LACLIMA, a network of Latin American climate lawyers, which I'm honored to be a part of. She is co-founder of the Amazonians for Climate Network and a consultant at the Oxford Sustainable Law Program. Dr. Medeiros holds a law degree from the Federal University of Pará, at the heart of the Brazilian Amazon. She holds an LLM and a PhD degree from the University of São Paulo Law School. Dr. Medeiros, the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes.
Thank you, Alessandra, and thank you to all the panelists. I wanted to apologize in advance. I'm at the venue at COP29. I had a panel right before this one, and I'll have a panel right after. So I apologize for the location. But diving right into it, I wanted to reflect some of the feelings that I've been hearing in this panel, which is urgency. And that's the feeling that we've been feeling already here at the corridors of COP and negotiation rooms. Negotiators also are out of patience. The world hasn't responded to this crisis as we were hoped that it would. And now we have reached a 1.1, 1.2 increase in global temperature. And we can feel the outcomes of this. We can feel the consequences. Everywhere there are disasters, everywhere there are extreme weather events that really impact people's lives and their their sustainability. And with this, I wanted to just not to bring again the views of only the Amazon, but forested lands as a whole. So I wanted to ask the following question. What does it mean to deliver climate action in forested areas? Well, I think it means giving its people the necessary tools to lead initiatives that endorse new economic options, meaning promoting local business. As Reshma said about private sector, it is important to have their buy-in, and not just in a national level, but local leaders also need to see the difference that this new development model can bring. These options, they need to support the rule of law, command and control policy, zero deforestation, and a just transition. And to this, we must develop an innovative bioeconomy for not just the Amazon region, but all forested lands. However, bioeconomy is still an emerging word and a conflicting concept. Its definition is still under dispute. As Alessandra just said, we have sectors of government and other research and private sector that see bioeconomy as biofuels, as production of cellulose, as monocultures. And although those businesses are legitimate, we need to understand that these are not the types of transformations that we need to sustain, to tackle both the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. And although there are conflicts among these concepts, these different approaches, they can coexist to a degree in these biomes that are vast and heterogeneous, as is the Amazon. Nevertheless, as I mentioned, there is a bioeconomy whose premises is a standing forest, and that's the bioeconomy that we should focus. And that concept entails that whichever production needs it's on that biome, it needs to be compatible or even reliant on the maintenance and the expansion of forested areas. Consequently, bioeconomy should promote zero deforestation, biodiversity, among other principles that work to ensure that integrity of the concept. And to that bioeconomy, the products are not central. The processes take the front row. A bioeconomy in areas, in forested areas such as Amazon and mega biodiverse areas should favor strengthening of economies deeply rooted and compatible with the standing forests and flowing rivers, with strong community elements that values traditional knowledges and indigenous people and local communities' ways of life. To this effect, the cities and industrial complexes can play a potential significant role by mediating and transforming the relationship between nature and society, meaning that these institutions can lay the foundation for where a social biodiverse bioeconomy can develop, thrive, and resulting in the conservation of the biome. And to this effect, I wanted to take a second to talk about an example. And this is a successful, and I'm going to bring two examples here. One that is successful and the other that is, well, in dispute. So the first one is a part of the production chain of acai. How did that production began? Acai was a product that was consumed a lot by people in the Amazon, but mainly rural people and people that were in the forests, riverside communities, indigenous people. However, because the berry didn't travel well, so by the time that it reached the cities and it got transformed, it went bad. So what happened was an industrial revolution in the Federal University of Pará, which permitted to that berry to have a longer lifeline. So they developed machines that could take the acai pulp and turn it into what we know as acai. Take the acai berry, turn it into a pulp as the pulp that we know. And that allowed for massive consumption of the item in Amazonian cities, such as Belém, Manaus, Santarém, and others. And that created an internal demand for that product. And it strengthened the whole chain of production because the financing, the funding for that berry, for that good, was rooted in a sustainable, reliant, local demand. And so with that, multiple production arrangements were created. There are hundreds of acai houses in Belém. There are hundreds of producers in the Amazon. And that generated wealth for those local communities at that local level. And I am talking about acai berries community-based production. I'm not talking about industrial acai berry production. And another thing that came was cacao and chocolate. So cacao is not native of the Amazon, but it began to be grown there in the last century. But it was external demand. The people in the region didn't consume that product. So what happened was that wealth generated by the product, it went to other places. It got scattered. It didn't stay. It didn't get territorialized. It didn't generate wealth in that region. So when we are talking about a bioeconomy, we have to talk about bioeconomy beyond monocultures. We have to talk about a bioeconomy that is multiple. Are no silver bullets. We cannot accelerate. We cannot enhance or scale bioeconomy. We need multiple production sites, multiple production locations, multiple productions to ensure that not one product is produced, but a variety of them is produced, and that generating and sustaining a biodiverse social bioeconomy. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your, it was incredibly nice to hear a voice from the Amazon, especially in the lead up to COP30 in Belém. So it's also incredibly important to hear from civil society. So thank you, Caroline, for adding this perspective. And we're pressed for time, so unfortunately we won't have time for questions as we have a very hard stop for our session in 4 minutes. So I wanted to wrap up by thanking you for a wonderfully interdisciplinary session, which was equally interesting for lawyers and non-lawyers alike. And I must say that it was truly fantastic to hear voices from academia, the private sector, and civil society all converge. So if I could summarize our session in one word that all of you brought up in some form or another, that word would be harmonization of multilateral regimes, of domestic regulation, of policy, of standards. So I will leave you with this takeaway, and again, thank our fantastic panelists for their time, wisdom, and generosity. And we'll close our session for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.